Imagine a political party so confident in its power that it doesn't realize it's tearing itself apart in real time. On one coast, Zoran Mamdani, the socialist rising star of New York, is watching his campaign unravel under the weight of scandal, exposed lies, and illegal foreign donations. On the other, Chuck Schumer is gambling the credibility of his entire party on a shutdown strategy that's collapsing faster than the polls can keep up. Both stories are happening at once, and they're connected, not by coincidence, but by cause. Because when a movement starts mistaking chaos for strategy, when ideology becomes louder than logic, the downfall doesn't come from the outside, it comes from within. What we're seeing right now isn't just political miscalculation. It's a system and feedback failure, burning through public trust like rocket fuel with no plan for landing. So let's break down how Mamdani's panic and Schumer's desperate gamble became two sides of the same self-inflicted collapse. Now, I want you to think about something for a moment. Have you ever watched a machine overheat because no one checked the temperature gauge? Maybe an old car engine, or even just a coffee maker left on too long. The warning signs were there, the steam, the smell, the noise, but someone ignored them, and eventually, the whole thing just gave out. That's what's happening right now in American politics, and specifically within the Democratic Party. Two crises, two coasts, one shared problem. They stopped listening to reality. Let's start with the big picture. We're more than a month into a government shutdown, and at the same time, New York City is just days away from electing a new mayor, and the frontrunner, a young Democratic socialist named Zoran Mamdani, is suddenly in freefall. His poll numbers are dropping, his credibility is shredded, and the more he talks, the worse it gets. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Senator Chuck Schumer thought he could use the shutdown as leverage, a bargaining chip to force through massive spending bills tied to health care for people who aren't even citizens. But here's the thing. Around 2/3 of Americans, according to recent polling, are blaming the Democrats for this mess. Not the Republicans, the Democrats. So you've got one leader trying to strong-arm the nation with a shutdown, and another trying to promise the moon to voters in the bluest city in America, and both of them are failing, publicly, spectacularly. And the reason they're failing is the same reason any complex system fails. They ignored the feedback. When systems fail, they fail predictably. When feedback is ignored, entropy wins. That's not politics, that's physics. So let's start where the meltdown began. Zoran Mamdani wasn't just another candidate. He was supposed to be the future. Young, energetic, a self-described democratic socialist with big ideas and even bigger promises. Free childcare for everyone, free buses, government-run grocery stores, a complete transformation of New York into what he imagined as a progressive paradise. For months, he led the race by double digits. His supporters were fired up, the media was intrigued, even skeptics admitted he had momentum. But then, as often happens when someone builds a campaign on emotion rather than evidence, the cracks started to show. First came the story about his aunt. Mamdani had been telling audiences repeatedly about how his aunt stopped riding the New York City subway after September 11th, 2001. Why? Because he claimed she wore a hijab, and the wave of Islamophobia in the city made her feel unsafe. It was a powerful story, personal, emotional, the kind of narrative that connects with voters on a visceral level. And for a while, no one questioned it. But here's the problem with stories in the digital age. They leave trails. And when journalists started checking the facts, the story fell apart. Turns out, Mamdani's aunt wasn't even in New York City during or after 9/11. She was living in Tanzania, halfway around the world. When confronted, Mamdani tried to backtrack. He said, well, maybe it wasn't his aunt. Maybe it was his father's distant cousin. But guess what? Investigators found that person too, also in Tanzania at the time. So the story, the emotional centerpiece of his campaign's appeal to marginalized communities, was false, completely fabricated. Now, I want you to think about what that does to trust. Because trust isn't just a feeling. It's a calculation. Every time someone tells you something, your brain is running a background process. Does this make sense? Does it fit with what I know? Can I rely on this person? And when the answer comes back no, it doesn't just affect that one story. It affects everything. If he lied about that, what else is he lying about? And that's where the second scandal came in. Reports surfaced that Mamdani's campaign had accepted nearly $13,000 in illegal foreign donations. Now, let me be clear about what that means. In the United States, only citizens or permanent legal residents can donate to political campaigns. That's federal law. It's not a guideline, it's not a suggestion, it's the rule. And Mamdani's campaign had taken money from over 170 contributors who lived outside the country. Some of those donations were returned once the story broke. But as of mid-October, nearly 90 foreign donations, totaling over $7,000, still hadn't been refunded. His opponents immediately called for a Justice Department investigation. So did former President Trump. And whether or not anything comes of that, the damage was done. Because here's the thing. Voters don't need to wait for a conviction to lose confidence. They just need a pattern. Lie about your family, take illegal money, refuse to clean it up quickly. That's a pattern. And patterns destroy campaigns. The latest polling shows Mamdani's lead shrinking dramatically. He's down to around 40% support. His main opponent, former Governor Andrew Cuomo, has surged to the mid-30s. That's a 7-point gap with a margin of error around 3 points. In other words, this race, which was supposed to be a blowout, is now competitive. And, more importantly, Mamdani's momentum has completely stalled. The energy is gone. The narrative has flipped. And ironically, it's Cuomo, of all people, who's gaining ground. But as Mamdani panicked, the ripple effect started hitting the rest of his party. Because this isn't just about one candidate in one city. It's about what that candidate represents. Mamdani was the fresh face, the bold vision, the next generation of progressive leadership. And if he can't even keep his story straight or follow basic campaign finance law, what does that say about the movement he represents? Let me ask you this. Have you ever watched someone dig themselves deeper into a hole by trying to explain their way out of a lie? It's painful to watch, and it's exactly what happened here. Mamdani didn't just get caught in a lie, he got caught in the cover-up, and then he got caught in the cover-up of the cover-up. At a certain point, it's not about the original mistake anymore. It's about judgment. It's about whether this person can be trusted with power. Now, here's where things get interesting from a systems perspective. If you're building a movement on emotion instead of integrity, the math eventually catches up. And what I mean by that is this. Emotions are powerful, but they're also unstable. They spike fast and crash hard. Integrity, on the other hand, is a slow build. It's boring. It doesn't make headlines. But it's what holds a structure together under pressure. Mamdani built his campaign on emotional appeals. Tax the rich, free everything, fight the system. But he didn't build the foundation. And when the pressure came, when people started asking, okay, but is any of this true? Can you actually deliver? Are you even following the rules? The whole thing started to collapse. And just as Mamdani's empire was collapsing locally, Schumer's gamble at the federal level was about to detonate nationally. We're now in the 4th or 5th week of a government shutdown. The exact count doesn't matter as much as the trend. And the trend is this. The longer it goes on, the worse it looks for the people who caused it. In this case, that's the Democrats. Now, let me be fair here. Shutdowns are always complicated. Both sides usually share some blame. But in this case, the polling is pretty clear. Around 2/3 of Americans, across the political spectrum, are pointing the finger at the Democrats. And the reason is simple. They're the ones who refuse to pass a budget unless it included massive spending increases for programs that a lot of people don't support. Specifically, we're talking about extending healthcare subsidies to people who entered the country illegally. Now, whether you think that's good policy or bad policy, it's undeniably controversial. And using a government shutdown as leverage to force it through, That's a gamble. A big one. Schumer thought he was playing chess. He thought he could hold the line, make the Republicans blink, and walk away with a win. But the board flipped, and every move started costing credibility. Now, here's what's so wild about this. Some of his own colleagues admitted this was the plan. Congresswoman Catherine Clark said the shutdown was a leverage point. Senator Chris Coons from Delaware said it was uncomfortable, but still a leverage point. Even Bernie Sanders acknowledged that reopening the government would mean losing leverage. So this wasn't a secret, this wasn't a conspiracy theory, this was the stated strategy. Use the shutdown as pressure, force the Republicans to the table, get what we want. But here's the problem with leverage. It only works if the other side feels more pain than you do. And right now, the Democrats are feeling a lot of pain, their approval ratings are tanking, their voters are frustrated, and even the media outlets that usually support them are starting to run stories about how the strategy backfired. Now, I'm not a political strategist, but I do understand systems. And one of the basic principles of any system is this. If you apply pressure without monitoring the feedback, you don't know when you're about to break something. Schumer applied pressure. He held the line. But he didn't listen to the feedback. The feedback was everywhere. Town halls, polls, social media, news coverage. All of it was saying the same thing. People want the government to work. They don't want theater. They don't want leverage games. They want their leaders to lead. And when you ignore that kind of feedback, reality finds a way to get your attention, usually all at once. Reports started coming out that Democrats were planning to end the shutdown right after this week's elections. New York's mayoral race, New Jersey's gubernatorial race, Virginia's governor's race. The theory, apparently, was that they could ride out the bad press until Tuesday, claim the high road after the votes were counted, and spin the whole thing as a principled stand. But here's the flaw in that plan. By the time they reopen the government, the damage is already done. The narrative is set. The voters have already decided who's to blame. So why make such a reckless play? That's where the real story begins. Because this isn't just about political leverage. It's about incentives. It's about money. And it's about a deeper agenda that most people don't fully understand until someone explains it clearly. Let me walk you through this. The funding bill that's tied up in the shutdown includes something between $1 and $2 trillion in spending over several years. A huge chunk of that money is earmarked for Medicaid expansion. Now, on the surface, that sounds reasonable. Medicaid helps people who need health care. But here's where it gets complicated. The way the bill is written, a lot of that money would go to states to cover health care costs for people who are in the country illegally. Now, whether you think that's compassionate policy or fiscal insanity, the economic reality is the same. It creates a massive financial incentive. States that accept this money can balance their budgets. States that don't will struggle. And for places like New York and California, which are already deep in debt, this isn't just helpful, it's essential. Without that federal money, those states would be looking at serious budget crises, possibly even bankruptcy. And while Schumer was losing ground, someone else stepped into the conversation with brutal clarity, not as a politician, but as someone who thinks about systems and incentives for a living. The conversation centered around a simple question. Why is this shutdown happening? And the answer, when you strip away the talking points, is this. Because if the funding gets cut, millions of people who came here expecting benefits will leave. And if they leave, certain states will lose voters. And if those states lose voters, one political party loses power. Now, I'm not telling you how to feel about that. I'm just walking you through the logic. If you create a financial incentive for people to come to a place, they'll come. If you remove that incentive, they'll leave. That's not politics, that's economics. And the reason this shutdown has dragged on for so long is because the stakes, for certain lawmakers, are existential. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine you own a business, and you've been paying people to stand in your store. Not to buy anything, just to make the place look busy. You're hoping that the appearance of activity will attract real customers, but it's costing you a fortune. And eventually, someone asks, why are we doing this? And you realize you don't have a good answer, except that if you stop, the store will look empty, and that's embarrassing. So you keep paying. Even though it's unsustainable, even though everyone can see it's not working. That's what's happening here. The Democrats are paying through federal funds to create the appearance of support, but the cost is astronomical, and the minute the funding stops, the whole thing falls apart. So Schumer's gamble isn't really about healthcare. It's about maintaining a system that artificially props up his party's electoral prospects in key states. And the shutdown is the last desperate attempt to keep that system alive. But as the polling shows, reality has a way of cutting through spin, and right now, reality is winning. Think about it this way. When incentives reward dysfunction, dysfunction multiplies. That's not a political statement. That's a systems observation. If you pay people to do something that doesn't create value, you get more of that behavior, and eventually you run out of money to keep paying for it. The question isn't whether the system will collapse. The question is when and how much damage it does on the way down. Now, here's where this connects back to Mamdani, because what he's promising in New York City is essentially the same model on a local scale. He wants to raise somewhere between $8 and $10 billion a year through new taxes, and then spend it on universal programs. Free childcare, free buses, government-run grocery stores, you name it. And to pay for all of this, he says he'll just tax the rich, raise the corporate tax rate by about 5 percentage points, add a 2% surcharge on income over $1 million. Simple, right? Except it's not simple at all, because the math doesn't work, and more importantly, the assumptions don't work. Let me explain. Right now, New York City already has some of the highest taxes in the country. When you combine state and local income taxes, the top earners in the city are paying around 15% on top of their federal taxes. That's higher than almost anywhere else in America. And Mamdani wants to push that to 17%. Now, if you're someone making $1 million a year or more, and you're already paying 15% in state and local taxes, what do you do when that jumps to 17%? Especially when you can move 20 miles away to Connecticut or 1,000 miles south to Florida and pay 0 state income tax? You leave. That's what you do. And that's what economists have been trying to tell anyone who will listen. The top 1% of taxpayers in New York City, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people, currently pay around 40% of the city's income tax revenue. If Mamdani's plan goes through, that dependency would jump to over 60%. So you'd have the entire city budget resting on the shoulders of a tiny group of highly mobile, highly motivated people who could solve their problem by simply moving. This is what economists call catastrophic concentration risk. You're putting all your eggs in one basket, and the basket has legs. It can walk away, and when it does, the whole system collapses. Not slowly, not gradually, all at once. But here's what's even more troubling. Mamdani fundamentally misunderstands how marginal tax rates work. When you raise the top marginal rate, you're not raising taxes on all income. You're raising taxes only on income above a certain threshold. So the revenue projections his campaign is putting out, they're wildly optimistic. Some independent analysts estimate he'd raise less than half of what he's claiming, which means either the programs don't get funded or the city goes into massive debt, or both. And this is where we see the same pattern that's playing out at the federal level. Ideology over economics, promises over planning, emotion over evidence. Let me ask you something. Have you ever known someone who made a big financial decision based purely on how they wanted things to be, rather than how things actually were? Maybe they bought a house they couldn't afford because they were sure they'd get a raise. Or they started a business without checking if there was actually demand for what they were selling. It feels good in the moment, it's exciting, it's bold. But when reality shows up, and it always does, the consequences are brutal. That's what's happening here. Mamdani is selling a vision. And visions are powerful, but visions without foundation are just fantasies. And you can't run a city of 8 million people on fantasy. Now, the reason this matters beyond just one election in one city is because it's a symptom of a much larger problem. When leadership turns ideology into insulation, reality finds a way in, usually all at once. And what we're seeing with both Mamdani and Schumer is that exact dynamic. They've insulated themselves from feedback, They've surrounded themselves with people who agree with them, who tell them what they want to hear, who reinforce the narrative, and as a result, they've lost touch with the ground. The polls are feedback. The scandals are feedback. The shrinking leads are feedback. The fact that 2/3 of Americans blame your party for a shutdown, that's feedback. But if you're not listening, if you're too invested in the story you've been telling yourself, then all that feedback just becomes noise. And eventually, the noise becomes a wave. And the wave washes everything away. Here's what I find fascinating from a systems perspective. Both of these situations, Mamdani's collapse and Schumer's gamble, are examples of the same kind of failure. They're feedback failures. In engineering, we talk about feedback loops all the time. A good system monitors itself. It checks its temperature, its pressure, its output. And when something starts to drift out of range, the system corrects, it adjusts. That's stability. But when you disable the feedback loop, when you ignore the sensors, the system doesn't gradually decline. It goes into runaway. And runaway always ends the same way, catastrophic failure. Political systems work the same way. The feedback comes from voters, from polls, from media coverage, from town halls, from protests, from donations, from all the signals that tell you whether your strategy is working. And when you ignore those signals because they don't fit your model, you're disabling the feedback loop. You're flying blind. And at some point, you hit the ground. Now, let's zoom out even further, because this isn't just about two politicians making bad decisions. This is about a political party at a crossroads. The Democratic Party, right now, is facing an existential identity crisis. On one side, you have the progressive wing, young, energetic, motivated by big ideas and bold promises. They want to transform the system. They want to tax the rich, expand government, provide universal services, and they have a lot of passion. On the other side, you have the pragmatic wing, older, more cautious, focused on winning elections and holding power. They want incremental change, coalition building, compromise. And right now, those two wings are pulling in opposite directions. Mamdani represents the first wing, Schumer represents the second. And both of them are failing. Which raises the question, if neither approach is working, what does? Let me share something with you. There's a concept from ancient philosophy, from Aristotle and Plato, about what makes a society stable. They figured out over 2,000 years ago that you can't have a functioning democracy or even a functioning republic unless the people in that society share a common sense of culture, identity, and investment. You need cohesion. You need people to feel like they're part of the same project, working toward the same goals, bound by the same values. When you lose that, when you have hundreds of different groups all pulling in different directions, all competing for resources, all defining success differently, the system breaks down. It doesn't matter how good your policies are. It doesn't matter how smart your leaders are. The foundation cracks, and everything built on it starts to crumble. And that's what we're seeing right now, not just in New York, not just in Washington, across the country. Blue states are hemorrhaging population. New York, California, Illinois, they're all losing residents, which means they're losing congressional seats, which means they're losing electoral votes, which means they're losing power. And the more they double down on policies that drive people away, the faster the decline happens. It's a feedback loop. But instead of correcting, they're accelerating. Instead of asking, why are people leaving? What are we doing wrong? They're asking, how do we get more federal money to make up for the lost tax base? That's not a solution. That's a patch. And patches only work for so long. Here's the thing. States compete. Cities compete. They compete for residents, for businesses, for talent, for capital. And if you make your state or city uncompetitive, people leave. They move to places with lower taxes, better services, more opportunity, safer streets, better schools. That's human nature. And no amount of ideology can override human nature. You can try. People have tried for centuries, and it always ends the same way. So when Governor Kathy Hochul the Democratic governor of New York, goes on television and essentially says, look, if Mamdani actually tries to do what he's promising, we're going to see a mass exodus like we've never seen before. She's not being disloyal. She's being realistic. She's acknowledging the feedback. She's saying, this doesn't work. The math doesn't work. The incentives don't work. And if we go down this road, we'll destroy the state. And the fact that she had to say that publicly about a candidate from her own party in one of the bluest cities in the country tells you everything you need to know about where things stand right now. Let me give you one more analogy, and then I'll bring this all together. Imagine you're running that company I mentioned earlier, and your product isn't selling. The feedback is clear. Customers don't want it. So you have two options. Option one, listen to the feedback, redesign the product, and give customers something they actually want. Option two, ignore the feedback, double down on your original design, and spend more money on marketing to convince people they're wrong. Which option works? Obviously, option one. But which option requires more humility? Also option one. Because option one means admitting you were wrong. It means changing course. It means putting results over ego. Right now, the Democratic Party is choosing option two. They're doubling down, they're spending more, they're marketing harder, but the product isn't improving. And the customers are walking away. Mamdani's implosion and Schumer's gamble are both symptoms